Whyun's heart raced as she stepped into the towering building of Kim Corporation. The lobby was massive, gleaming with marble floors, large glass windows letting in the morning light, and towering pillars that screamed luxury. Every detail here was a reflection of the power and wealth Taehyung commanded. As she walked through the entrance, her heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the silent, intimidating space. She had to remind herself she belonged here. It wasn't her dream to work for someone like Taehyung, but it was a step she had to take. She had no other choice. The only way out of her past was to survive, and this was the only path available. She had never met him in person, but she knew of him. Everyone knew Kim Taehyung. Cold, arrogant, and brilliant, he had single-handedly made Kim Corporation one of the most powerful conglomerates in South Korea. His reputation for being ruthless in business was matched only by his indifference to people. "Ms. Lee Wai-in, please," the receptionist said, her voice warm, but there was something nervous in her eyes. "The CEO is waiting for you." Wai-in didn't smile back. She didn't have the time or energy for pleasantries. With a curt nod, she followed the receptionist to the elevator. The doors opened smoothly, and they rode in silence as the elevator ascended higher and higher. The tension in the air was thick. When the doors finally opened to the top floor, the receptionist gave her one last glance. "Good luck," she said softly before stepping away. The office was everything Wai-in had expected: sophisticated, cold, and polished. The large desk sat in the middle of the room, facing away from the door, giving off a sense of authority. Behind it sat a man who didn't seem to notice her at all as he looked over papers. Kim Taehyung was exactly how people described him: tall with sharp features that could easily belong to a statue, and an aura of complete control. His jet black hair was styled to perfection, and his expensive suit clung to his broad shoulders. He looked like a man who owned the world. Wai-in felt a flutter of nerves, but she didn't let it show. This was business, not a date. She wasn't here to impress him. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Kim." His gaze flicked up, meeting hers with cold, calculating eyes. For a moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, his eyes piercing her like he was reading her soul. The silence stretched on longer than Wai-in was comfortable with. "So, you're the one who's supposed to help me." Taehyung's voice was deep, low, and slightly mocking, as if he already knew the answer. Wai-in's chin tilted up slightly. "I don't need your help, Mr. Kim. I'm here because I have a proposition for you." Taehyung's eyebrows raised, a slight smirk curling the edges of his lips. He leaned back in his chair, looking far too relaxed for someone who was supposed to be the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. "Oh, and what makes you think I'll be interested in whatever you have to offer?" Wai-in didn't flinch. She wasn't here to back down. "I've done my research on you, Kim Corporation. The work you do, the way you've turned this company into a powerhouse. I know you don't need anyone, but I'm guessing you'll need someone like me soon enough." Taehyung stared at her for a beat, clearly trying to gauge her. His eyes softened for a split second, though his expression remained cold and impassive. "Do you always talk this much? Or is it just for me?" Wai-in didn't back down. "I'm not here to make small talk, Mr. Kim. I'm here because I have something you need, and I'm sure I can deliver." Wai-in crossed her arms, stepping closer. "Is that why your company is running itself into the ground?" She shot back, her voice sharp. "You can't do everything, Mr. Kim. The world isn't run by a one-man army. Even you can't carry this on your own forever." For a moment, there was an eerie silence in the room. Taehyung's eyes narrowed, and Wai-in felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having struck a nerve. "You think you know what's best for me?" he asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You think I need a woman like you to come in here and tell me how to run my company? I think you need someone who can handle things while you focus on the bigger picture." Wai-in shot back, not backing down. "You can't possibly manage every little detail by yourself, no matter how much you want to." Taehyung stood up, suddenly towering over her. There was no smile on his face, only coldness. Don't mistake your arrogance for intelligence. You're here because you think you can change my mind. But that's where you're wrong. You'll never be able to control me. Wyman held his gaze without flinching. I'm not here to control you. I'm here to make sure you don't destroy everything you built because of your stubbornness. The silence between them was thick, charged with tension. Taehyung, though seemingly unshaken, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and irritation. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. You must be new to this city if you're bold enough to come here and speak to me like that. You have no idea who I am, do you? Wyman's lips curled into a confident smile. Oh, I know exactly who you are, Taehyung Kim, the arrogant CEO who thinks he can do everything on his own. But we both know that's not true. You need someone like me to clean up the messes you leave behind. Someone who's not afraid to speak their mind. Taehyung's eyes flashed with something amusement, maybe just the challenge of dealing with a woman who wasn't scared of him. He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. You're not afraid of me, are you? He asked softly, almost dangerously. That's a mistake most people make. Wyman stood her ground, staring him down. No, I'm not afraid of you. And that's what makes me better equipped for the job. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen between them. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of her breath, the tension almost palpable. Taehyung studied her with narrowed eyes, a dangerous glint in his gaze. Then, to her surprise, he broke the silence. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, he said, his voice low. I'm curious to see which one it is. I'm neither, Wyman said, her voice steady. I'm just here to do what you can't, whether you like it or not. Taehyung stood still for a moment longer before nodding ever so slightly. All right, let's see what you've got. But know this, if you fail, I won't hesitate to get rid of you. Understand? Wyman's eyes met his, unwavering. I understand perfectly. The following day, after hours of rigorous negotiation and silent analysis, Wyman found herself standing before Taehyung once again in his sleek, high-rise office. This time, however, there was something different in the air, a shift, almost imperceptible but real. They had spent the past few days hashing out the details of the European deal, but there was an additional complexity to their work now, attention that neither of them could ignore. Taehyung's attention was focused on his laptop as Wyman entered, a small stack of papers in hand. He looked up briefly, his gaze hard and calculating, before returning to his work. You have something to say, he asked, not bothering to look directly at her. Wyman took a deep breath. It was now or never. Yes, actually. I've been thinking. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, his interest barely noticeable. About the deal with the European investors, Wyman began, her voice steady. I have an idea that could give us an edge. He paused, finally looking up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. What kind of idea? A solution that could guarantee the deal. You'll need more than just a solid business plan. You need to show them that you're committed, that Kim Corporation's legacy is untouchable. That's where I come in. Taehyung's eyes sharpened, his body leaning slightly forward as he focused entirely on her. Go on, Wyman exhaled, her gaze never wavering from his. A marriage, a contract marriage, something that shows stability. A personal commitment. She crossed her arms, her voice calm. You marry me, and it becomes a symbol of everything the company stands for: endurance, loyalty, power. It will seal the deal. Taehyung's lips curled into a smirk, and for a moment, his amusement was palpable. Marriage, is that what you've come up with? Yes, Wyman said firmly. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You marry me, and the investors will see your commitment to the future of this company. The room was silent for a moment. Taehyung stood up, walking toward the large windows, his back to her as he gazed out at the city below. Wyman stood still, waiting. The weight of the proposal hung in the air, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "And what do you want in return?" Widen took a step forward, a chance to prove myself. "To show you that I can handle what you can't," Taehyung turned, his gaze fixed on her. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, but his expression remained unreadable. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said again. "But marriage is a big step. Are you really ready for that?"
YN didn't hesitate. "I've been ready for this kind of challenge my whole life. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Kim Corporation stays on top." Taehyung looked at her, his expression serious now. "All right. But this isn't going to be easy."
"I know," YN said, her voice unwavering. "But I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Kim, and I'm not afraid of what this marriage might entail." For a long moment, Taehyung simply stared at her, his eyes intense. Finally, he spoke. "Fine," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We have a deal. But remember, this is only business, nothing more." YN nodded, the tension between them finally breaking, even as the weight of the decision settled in both their hearts. This was just the beginning, and neither of them knew how it would end. The first few days after their whirlwind marriage were nothing short of awkward. KIMTAEHYUNG, CEO of Kim Corporation, had married YN, a woman he barely knew, in an arrangement that he thought would suit his professional needs. YN, on the other hand, had accepted the arrangement reluctantly, but for reasons only she understood. She couldn't just walk away. Taehyung's mansion was everything a high-powered CEO's home should be: sleek, modern, and cold. Glass windows covered the walls, offering panoramic views of Seoul's skyline. The marble floors and the minimalist decor only added to the sense of isolation. Yet, as YN walked through the grand halls, she couldn't help but feel out of place. This was a world she didn't belong to. She had come here to escape her past, not to walk into another cage. Her morning was spent in silence. She wandered the house, not really knowing what to do with herself. The silence was deafening. Taehyung, as usual, was buried in his work, ignoring her existence like he always did. The tension between them simmered in the air, but YN wasn't one to shy away from conflict. It was late in the afternoon when Taehyung finally came out of his office, his face as cold as ever. He walked past her, barely acknowledging her presence, but she had had enough. "Taehyung," she called, her voice sharp as she stood in the doorway to his office. He stopped in his tracks, but didn't turn around. His back was to her, and the silence stretched on. "What now?" he asked, his tone clipped, but he didn't look at her. YN crossed her arms. "Are we just going to pretend like this is normal? Like this marriage doesn't exist?" Taehyung turned to face her, his eyes narrowed. "It's only business, YN, nothing more." "Then maybe you should start acting like it," YN replied, not backing down. "Don't just ignore me. I'm your wife, whether you like it or not." Taehyung raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a sarcastic smile. "Oh, I didn't realize we were in such a rush to make this official. Should I start calling you wife now?" "You can call me whatever you like," YN said dryly. "But I'd prefer it if we acted like adults here." A smirk tugged at the corner of Taehyung's lips, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the door, his stride as confident as ever. "Fine, but don't expect me to pamper you, YN. This isn't some fairy tale." That night, Taehyung invited his closest friends over for dinner. Him, Jungkook, and J-Hope were his lifelong companions, and they had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. Despite his cold exterior, he had a soft spot for them, something only a few people ever saw. YN didn't know what to expect from the dinner, but as soon as she entered the dining room, the atmosphere shifted. The three men, him, Jungkook, and J-Hope, were already seated at the table, talking and laughing, creating a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the mansion. Him, with his wide, bright smile, was the first to notice her. Widen, he said warmly, standing up to greet her. It's so nice to finally meet you. Jungkook looked up from his phone, his eyes bright but mischievous. So this is the woman who finally managed to tie down our dear Taehyung? Widen couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the playful jab. I didn't tie him down. I'm just here for the ride. J-Hope, always the loudest of the group, let out a laugh. I like her already. You two are going to make this interesting. Taehyung walked in just as the banter was heating up. He gave a sharp glance toward his friends, his lips tight. All right, enough, he said, his voice firm. Let's eat. The meal itself was a lavish affair with plates of gourmet food spread out in front of them. The men joked and laughed, their camaraderie clearly evident. Despite his outward coldness, Taehyung couldn't suppress the small smile that played at his lips every time his friends made him laugh. Widen, however, stayed mostly quiet, taking in the scene. She had never seen Taehyung in this light before, laughing, teasing, and even showing a hint of affection toward his friends. It was so different from the man who had barely spoken to her since their wedding. As the evening went on, the conversations grew more personal. Himmin turned to Widen with a curious look. So, Widen, tell us about yourself. What made you agree to marry our cold-hearted friend here? Widen leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Well, I didn't exactly have much of a choice, she said, her tone blunt. But I'm not one to back down from a challenge, and Taehyung Kim. Well, he's the biggest challenge of all. Taehyung rolled his eyes, but there was an amused glint in his gaze. You're not making this easier for me, Widen. Widen met his gaze. I don't need to. You're perfectly capable of making things difficult all on your own. The friends laughed, but Taehyung's face remained unreadable. Later that night, after dinner, Widen found herself in the living room, pacing back and forth. She couldn't shake the feeling that her marriage to Taehyung wasn't just a business arrangement. It felt like a cage, a carefully constructed one that she couldn't escape from. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting Taehyung, but it was J-Hope who appeared, his expression more serious than she had seen it all evening. You okay? He asked, his voice softer than usual. Widen sighed, dropping down onto the couch. I'm fine. It's just, this whole situation is a mess. I don't know what to do with myself. Taehyung, he's so distant. So cold, J-Hope sat down beside her, giving her a sympathetic look. Yeah, he can be a bit of a handful, but he's not as bad as he seems. You just have to get through the walls he's built up. Widen chuckled dryly. I've been trying, believe me. J-Hope smiled slightly. You know, I think you're the only one who's actually gotten under his skin. I haven't seen him argue this much with anyone in years. Widen smirked. Well, I'm not afraid to speak my mind. He may be a CEO, but he's still a human being. The next day, Taehyung called Widen into his office again. This time, the tension was even more palpable than before. She walked in, already prepared for whatever Taehyung had in store. He didn't greet her this time. Instead, he looked at her with a stern expression. We need to discuss our arrangement. Widen raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. You're not here to just live in my house and pretend like this is some kind of fairy tale, Taehyung said coldly. You have a role to play in Kim Corporation. I expect you to start acting like a proper wife. Widen's expression hardened. And what exactly do you mean by that? I need you to attend events, represent the company when I can't be there, and play the part, Taehyung continued, his voice stern. This isn't just about appearances. It's about securing my place at the top. Widen clenched her fists at her sides. You really think you can control me, don't you? Taehyung's eyes flicked to hers. I don't need to control you. But I do need you to understand that this isn't about feelings. This is about business. Widen smirked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Business, huh? Well, if you want me to be your wife in name only, you're going to have to try harder than that. Taehyung didn't reply. but the challenge in his eyes was clear. Their marriage was no longer just a business deal, it was a battleground. The following weeks after their marriage were filled with heated arguments, awkward silences, and occasional moments of unexpected closeness. Kim Taehyung and YN's arrangement was supposed to be purely business, yet with each passing day, the lines between duty and personal feelings began to blur, especially for Taehyung. His cold, calculated exterior remained intact for the most part, but inside, he felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite name whenever YN stepped into his world. Meanwhile, YN, ever the strong-willed woman with no filter, kept challenging his every move. She didn't care about his power, his wealth, or his status. She saw him as the arrogant CEO he was, and she didn't hesitate to remind him of it. But now, things were about to get even more complicated. A new person entered their lives, Minsu, YN's childhood friend, who had been like family to her. What Taehyung didn't know, and what YN was keeping from him, was that Minsu was gay and she had always felt a deep, unspoken connection with him. The thing was, Minsu had never openly admitted his feelings to YN, and she had never reciprocated them. They were simply best friends. However, things weren't going to stay that simple for long. It was another one of those rare evenings when the Kim mansion felt somewhat alive. The house was quieter than usual, with Taehyung locked away in his office, probably busy with work, as usual. YN, on the other hand, was sitting on the couch in the living room, scrolling through her phone and attempting to pass time. She had just texted Minsu, asking if he wanted to join her for dinner, and, of course, he had said yes. He was the one person who always brought a smile to her face when things got too tense with Taehyung. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, and YN jumped to her feet, immediately heading to the door. She opened it to find Minsu standing there, his usual carefree smile on his face. "Minsu," she grinned, "you're late." He chuckled, leaning in to give her a quick hug. "Sorry, traffic was a nightmare." "You know how it is in Seoul." YN stepped aside to let him in. "I'll never understand why you're always late, but it's fine. Come on in. I've got wine and snacks." As they walked into the living room, Minsu looked around with a raised eyebrow. "Man, this place is huge. Do you really live here?" "Feels more like a museum than a home." YN laughed, sitting down on the couch. "I know, right? It's a little too perfect for my taste. But I'm surviving." She motioned for him to take a seat, which he did eagerly, both of them casually chatting about their day as the minutes passed. What neither of them noticed was that Taehyung had stepped out of his office, and as he passed the living room, he froze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Minsu lounging on the couch with YN. Minsu was the complete opposite of Taehyung, warm, open, and carefree. And there was something about the way he interacted with YN that sent a strange feeling crawling under Taehyung's skin. He didn't understand it, he shouldn't care, but for some reason, seeing Minsu laugh and joke with YN made his chest tighten in an odd way. What was this feeling, he thought, a knot forming in his stomach? "Why do I feel like I'm being ignored?" His thoughts were interrupted when YN looked up and caught sight of him standing in the doorway, his gaze cold and unreadable. "Taehyung," she called out, her voice bright, though there was an edge to it. "What's with the face? Come join us. This is Minsu, my friend from forever ago." Taehyung gave a curt nod, his expression distant. "I'm busy. You two enjoy yourselves." But before he could retreat back into his office, YN shot him a knowing look. "Oh, come on. Don't be a jerk." "It's not like I'm going to bite you." Her voice was playful, but there was something about her teasing tone that made Taehyung's temper flare. Minsu, always the one to lighten the mood, grinned. "Don't mind him. He's just a bit grumpy." "You know, the CEO life must be hard." YN rolled her eyes. "You're one to talk. You're the one who spends his days buying shoes and bags." "CEO life isn't hard. It's just a lot of paperwork. And bags. CEO life isn't hard. It's just a lot of paperwork." Taehyung stiffened at the mention of his position. He didn't like how Hwagin so casually dismissed his role at Kim Corporation. But it was Minsu's presence that irked him the most. There was no denying the connection between them. They were so comfortable with each other, like old friends who shared an unspoken bond. Minsu leaned back, crossing his legs. It's not just about work, though. Sometimes you need a break from all that coldness, right, Taehyung? He teased. Taehyung's gaze flicked to Minsu, and he felt an unusual tightness in his chest. You seem to think you know a lot about me, he said, his voice low. His words were almost laced with an irritation he couldn't explain. Hwagin didn't miss the subtle tension in the room. She glanced between Minsu and Taehyung, and despite her usual indifference to his moods, she felt a flicker of amusement. Oh, Taehyung, don't tell me you're jealous, she teased, crossing her arms over her chest. Taehyung's eyes narrowed, and he shot her a look that said, don't push it. But Hwagin wasn't backing down. I mean, come on. It's not like you're the first man to ever talk to me, Tae, she said with a smirk, deliberately using his nickname to provoke him. Minsu laughed at the playful banter, clearly enjoying himself. Ooh, he's getting defensive now. Maybe I should leave you to figure this out. Taehyung didn't respond, but the feeling of jealousy was gnawing at him more than he wanted to admit. He couldn't understand why, but every time he saw Minsu and Hwagin together, it felt like something inside him was unraveling. The carefree laughter, the inside jokes, the way they looked at each other, it was a reminder of everything he lacked in his own marriage. What's wrong with me? Taehyung thought, his fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. It's not like I care about her, right? But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The night dragged on with more teasing, casual conversation, and moments that pushed Taehyung closer to his breaking point. He couldn't shake the feeling that Minsu's presence was a constant reminder of how much he was missing. But the more Hwagin got under his skin, the more he realized something strange. He didn't want to admit it, but he might have started to care about her more than he wanted to. Yet, his pride was too strong, so instead of confronting his feelings, he chose to retreat into his cold, silent world, waiting for the day when he could finally resolve the inexplicable emotions tangled inside him. The war between Taehyung and Hwagin had only intensified as the days passed. Their marriage, originally intended as a contract, had slowly begun to feel like something more, at least for Hwagin, and she'd always been independent and unapologetically herself, but now she couldn't help but feel a strange pull towards her cold, arrogant husband. It was confusing, unexpected, and utterly infuriating. For Taehyung, though, the confusion was even worse. He couldn't pinpoint when it started, but slowly he began to notice small things that made his chest tighten in a way that was foreign to him. Like how Hwagin's laugh brightened up a room, how her eyes sparkled when she was irritated, and how he seemed to catch himself watching her when he thought no one was looking. It was unsettling, and for someone like him, who prided himself on maintaining control, the growing affection he felt for her was something he wasn't prepared for. But neither of them would admit it. Their pride, stubbornness, and ever-present war of wills kept them in check. It was another one of those lavish events that Kim Corporation frequently hosted. Taehyung was expected to make an appearance, and as usual, Hwagin was by his side, though their interactions were cold, minimal, and laced with tension. As they entered the grand hall, Hwagin looked around, adjusting the strap of her elegant dress. The place was filled with the rich and powerful, people who lived in a world she didn't entirely understand, but tonight, she didn't care. She was only focused on the person beside her. Taehyung, on the other hand, was in his element. He moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, a sharp, calculating glint in his eyes as he exchanged greetings with business partners and high-profile clients. But there was something about the evening that didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the fact that Hwagin was close, yet so far away, her presence a constant reminder of the walls between them. And then, as if fate itself had decided to throw a wrench into the gears of their fragile peace, Yeji walked into the room. Yeji, Taehyung's ex-girlfriend, was everything Hwayun wasn't. She was polished, perfect, and undeniably beautiful. The moment she stepped into the room, she caught sight of Taehyung, her lips curling into a predatory smile as she made her way toward him. She didn't even acknowledge why, and as she slid up beside Taehyung, the familiar scent of her perfume filling the space between them. "Taehyung," Yeji purred, her voice smooth and practiced. "I didn't expect to see you here." "It's been so long." Taehyung's face remained neutral, but his lips twisted into a tight smile. "Yeji," he replied, though the word held no warmth. His eyes flicked to Hwayun, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed and looking utterly unimpressed. "This is my wife, Hwayun," he added, his tone distant but formal. Hwayun, who had been silent up until now, felt her anger flare. Who does she think she is? Hwayun thought, but she smiled, the kind of smile that was more dangerous than it looked. "It's nice to meet you, Yeji," Hwayun replied sweetly, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm sure you've heard plenty of rumors, but I assure you, Taehyung and I are doing just fine, and we're not looking for advice." Taehyung's jaw clenched slightly, but he kept his composure. He didn't want any drama, especially not tonight. But he could feel Yeji's eyes lingering on Hwayun, the way she sized her up, trying to belittle her with just a glance. He wasn't going to stand for it, not now, not ever. Yeji, however, didn't take the hint. She stepped closer to Taehyung, her fingers brushing against his arm as she spoke. "Well, it must be quite the adjustment for her, being married to someone like you, huh?" Her voice was sweet, but the malice behind her words was unmistakable. Hwayun's smile turned more pointed. "Oh, trust me, I'm not the one who needs adjusting," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. She leaned forward, looking at Yeji with a mock sweetness. "I'm sure it was hard for you to move on after you couldn't keep him. I guess it's not easy when someone finds someone better, huh?" The words were a sharp jab, delivered with a precision that left Yeji visibly shaken, though she tried to hide it. Hwayun continued, her voice rising slightly. "But don't worry, I'm sure Taehyung is just as good at playing pretend as you are. He probably needed someone perfect like you once upon a time, didn't he? But things change, people change." Taehyung's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the way Hwayun had taken control of the conversation. He didn't know whether to feel proud of her or worried that she was making a scene. Yeji's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing at Hwayun. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she said, her voice cold now. "Just because you've got him now doesn't mean you'll keep him. You're nothing but a contract wife." Hwayun's eyes glinted with a dangerous light. "And you're nothing but a past mistake, Yeji," she said, her tone smooth and lethal. "I'm not the one who had to settle for second place. Maybe you should stop trying to tear other people down and focus on picking up the pieces of your own life." Yeji, for all her poise, was momentarily speechless, her face flushing with embarrassment and anger. But she quickly regained her composure and shot Hwayun a glare before turning to Taehyung, her voice dripping with venom. "You're making a huge mistake, Taehyung. She's not the one you want." Read more. Taehyung, whose expression had darkened at the way Yeji was speaking to Hwayun, finally spoke up, his voice low and dangerous. "That's enough, Yeji," he said firmly, his eyes hardening. "I don't appreciate you disrespecting my wife. Don't ever try to belittle her again." Hwayun's heart skipped a beat at his words, and she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know why it made her feel so good, but hearing Taehyung stand up for her despite the tension between them made something inside her stir. Yeji, however, wasn't done. "You've always been arrogant, Taehyung. I hope you realize that you've made a huge mistake," she sneered, before turning and walking away with a huff. As Yeji left, Taehyung turned to Hwayun, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. She raised an eyebrow, still feeling the buzz of the confrontation in her veins. "You know," she said, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips, "I didn't think you'd actually stand up for me," Taehyung scoffed, his tone dismissive. "I don't need to explain myself to you, Wyan. I was just making it clear that I don't tolerate disrespect." Wyan chuckled softly. "Right, you didn't care at all." She wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily, especially not when his words made her heart flutter unexpectedly. But for a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Taehyung felt something in his chest tighten. Was it pride, protection? He couldn't quite tell. All he knew was that the woman who had become his wife, his contract wife, had done something to him that no one ever had, and he hated that he couldn't control it. As the night wore on, the tension between them only grew, both of them unaware of the quiet stirrings of emotion taking root in their hearts. They may have been at war, but something deeper, something far more complicated was quietly growing between them. Wyan might have been infuriating, frustrating, and absolutely impossible at times, but there was no denying that she was starting to get under his skin. And as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't stop the pull. And Wyan. She was falling for him too, whether she wanted to admit it or not. But for now, the war continued, with both of them too proud to acknowledge the change happening in their hearts. The day of the investor meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Wyan had spent the entire morning preparing, reviewing the contract, memorizing every detail, and rehearsing her points. This meeting would be the first real test of her abilities, and she couldn't afford to fail. As she walked into the conference room, Taehyung was already seated at the head of the table, his usual expression of indifference firmly in place. The European investors were seated around him, all of them looking sharp and professional. But there was something about the way they watched her as she took her seat beside Taehyung that made her feel small. She had to remind herself that she belonged here. This was her role now, fiancée to KIMTAEHYUNG, strategic partner in his empire. The meeting started with Taehyung discussing the financial projections, the numbers, and the plans for expansion. He spoke with the kind of confidence that only someone in his position could exude. But as the conversation shifted to the personal aspect of the deal, Wyan's nerves kicked in. This was where the marriage proposal would be discussed. Taehyung's voice cut through the tension in the room. "As I've said before, our commitment to this deal is not just business, it's personal," he said, his eyes flicking to "and the marriage is a symbol of our dedication to long-term success. Wyan and I are united in our goals, and this partnership will ensure that our vision for the future is realized." Wyan straightened in her seat, forcing herself to remain composed. This wasn't the time to hesitate. She had to prove her worth, show that she could handle this pressure. Indeed, she spoke up, her voice firm and steady. "This marriage isn't just a formality. It's a testament to the strength and stability we bring to the table. Together, we represent the future of Kim Corporation." The investors nodded, exchanging looks of approval. But Wyan noticed the sharpness in Taehyung's gaze as he looked at her. Was he pleased, or was he just watching to see if she would crack under pressure? For the next hour, they discussed the final details of the deal, Wyan offering her insights and contributions whenever necessary. She could feel the weight of Taehyung's expectations on her shoulders, but with every passing minute, she felt a little more confident. She wasn't here to play second fiddle to anyone. She had a role to fill, and she intended to fill it well. By the end of the meeting, the investors seemed satisfied. Taehyung nodded curtly, signaling that the deal was almost finalized. "Thank you, Miss Lee," Taehyung said as the room began to empty. His tone was still distant, but there was something different in his eyes. Wyan smiled inwardly, knowing that, for once, she had impressed him. As the door closed behind the last investor, Wyan turned to Taehyung. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but confident. Taehyung stood, buttoning his jacket as he glanced at her. "For now," he replied, his gaze cold again. But remember, this is just the beginning. In nodded. I won't forget. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the start of something far more complicated and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Taehyung had been watching her for weeks now, but there was something about why, and that just didn't add up. She was unlike any woman he had ever met. Confident, composed, but also oddly distant when it came to him his new wife. Yet she refused every luxury he tried to offer. The brand new Bugatti he gifted her was still parked in the garage, untouched. Instead, she continued to drive her old Mini Cooper, the same one she had before the marriage. He had made it clear that she could have anything she wanted, yet she refused to even touch his black card, claiming that she didn't need it. Every time he tried to offer her something, whether it was a lavish dinner or a new piece of jewelry, she turned him down. It was confusing, irritating even. Why didn't she want to accept his help? And why was she so determined to keep everything about her life private? It drove him crazy. Late one night, after another long day at the office, Taehyung walked through the dimly lit hallway of their lavish house. Their marriage was still more of a formality than anything else to people in separate rooms bound together by a contract. She had her own space, and he had his. It wasn't like he cared. He preferred the distance. But something about why and kept nagging at him. He was curious, and that curiosity had only deepened over time. As he passed by her room on his way to the kitchen, he heard something soft murmurs at first, followed by a sharp gasp. Pausing, Taehyung listened closely. No, please don't. An's voice was faint but frantic. Stop, Juan. Stop it, please, double quotes. Taehyung's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Who was Juan? And why was she talking about him in her sleep? He stayed frozen in place, barely breathing, as he heard her continue, her voice trembling. No, please don't hurt me. I don't want this, stop, please, double quotes. Taehyung's chest tightened. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. He had never heard why in talk like that. She was always so composed, so collected in front of him. But now, in the privacy of her room, she seemed to be tormented by someone named Juan. Before he could process what he had just overheard, Wai-in suddenly jolted awake, her breathing rapid, as if she had been in the middle of a nightmare. She sat up in bed with wide eyes, her face pale, looking around the room as though she was disoriented. Taehyung quickly stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind was spinning, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened between Wai-in and this Juan had left her shaken. He quickly retreated to his own room, trying to calm himself down. This had gone beyond mere curiosity. Something was wrong, and he needed answers. The next morning, Taehyung sat in his office, his fingers drumming anxiously on the desk. His thoughts were consumed by Wai-in's words, her frantic plea in her sleep. It was strange how someone like her, so strong and independent, could be hiding something so dark. He had to know what happened, and if she wasn't going to tell him, he would find out on his own. Picking up his phone, he dialed the number of his trusted private investigator, Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim, I need you to look into something for me. It's urgent, Taehyung said, his voice steady but tinged with a cold edge. Of course, Mr. Kim. What is it? Mr. Kim's voice came through, professional as always. I need you to find out everything you can about my wife Wai-in, specifically her past. I want to know everything about her life before she married me, Taehyung said, leaning back in his chair. And I want it done quietly. No one can know. There was a brief pause before Mr. Kim responded, understood. I'll get back to you in 2 days. 2 days later, Taehyung sat in his office, impatiently glancing at the clock. The minutes seemed to drag by. His thoughts kept drifting back to Wai, and the way she spoke in her sleep, the way she refused his help, and most importantly, the name she kept repeating, Juan. Finally, His phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Kim. He opened it immediately, reading the details that had been gathered. Mr. Kim, the person named Kang Juan is Y and Lee's ex-fiancé. The two were engaged for over 2 years, but the engagement was broken off under mysterious circumstances. There have been reports of emotional distress on Y's side during the engagement, and she was never forthcoming about the reason for the split. Mr. Juan has been searching for answers ever since the breakup, and it seems he's still trying to figure out why the engagement ended. Attached are photos of Kang Juan. Taehyung stared at the message, his mind racing as he looked at the attached photo of a man with sharp features and dark hair. The man looked harmless enough, but Taehyung could tell there was something off. He was no fool. He knew that the fact Yvonne had never mentioned him meant there was something more to the story. Yvonne had always been closed off when it came to her personal life, but now Taehyung realized that there were things she was hiding, things that might be connected to her troubled past. This Kang Juan wasn't just a figure from her past. He seemed to have some hold on her, even now. Taehyung's fingers tightened around the phone as he stared at the picture of Kang Juan. What happened? Why? He murmured to himself, his gaze darkening. He had always been someone who liked to be in control, someone who could read people easily, but why? She was an enigma. Every time he thought he understood her, she would do something to throw him off balance. He didn't like not knowing. And this was the first time in a long time that Taehyung felt utterly uncertain about something about someone. The next day, as Taehyung walked through the corridors of Kim Corporation, his mind was occupied with thoughts of Yvonne. He had to find out more about her, about Kang Juan, about what happened between them. He couldn't let this go. The mystery surrounding her past was eating away at him, and he couldn't stand not knowing the full story. He needed to confront her, but how, and would she even tell him the truth? His thoughts were interrupted as his assistant entered the room. Mr. Kim, there's a visitor here to see you. Taehyung raised an eyebrow. Who? Mr. Juan Kong.